Hi, my name is Catherine Schofield. I'm a senior at the University of Nevada, Reno, and I'm planning on graduating this May. One of my classes this semester is about feminist research theories and methods. This is a special one-off podcast episode that's been inspired by the recent developments in homophobic and transphobic laws that are being passed all over the country as my final project in this class. There are many influential factors in what shape our society's norms, standards, and stigmas, but media such as movies, TV, music, and books may be the most accessible to everyday people. Disney is a massive corporation that owns many different companies such as Marvel, Pixar, 21st Century Fox, ABC, Hulu, ESPN, and Vice, among many others. However, the recent passing of House Bill 1557 in Florida, also known as the Don't Say Gay Bill, it's come out that Disney contributed funds to many politicians supporting this bill. Disney employees were outraged by their employer's lack of support for the LGBTQ+ community, and Disney and its subsidiaries scrambled to keep pushback to a minimum. Part of that included a letter from Disney CEO Bob Chapek where he wrote, quote, "For nearly a century, our company's stories have opened minds, inspired dreams, shown the world both as it is and how we wish it could be, and now, more than ever before, represent the incredible diversity of our society," end quote. But later in that same letter, Chapek admitted that Disney contributed to politicians on both sides of the issue, those who supported LGBTQ rights and those who don't. While Disney claims to be in support of a diverse range of cultures and peoples, the stories that they tell in their Disney animated feature films and those live-action counterparts misrepresent or erase many minority groups. I propose that Disney should look back at films they have already created that include strong female leads and queer-coded characters in order to see how they can successfully include canon queer and trans characters in future movies. In this podcast, I'll be taking a look at feature films produced by Disney and Pixar, including any live-action counterparts to classic animated films, to see how Disney has represented queer characters, to show the history of Disney female leads, and to theorize about how Disney could implement queer stories modeled off of how they changed female lead structures in their movies. We'll start by looking at how women's roles in Disney movies have changed as society's expectations of women changed. In the first few Disney movies to feature female leads, they were all pretty helpless. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was the first Disney movie ever to be released in 1937, and she's a very good example of that. Snow White is pushed to the boundaries of society by her evil stepmother and forced to cook and clean for 7 different men, and at the end of the movie, she's only saved by a kiss from a prince. The other 2 movies in this era, Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty, don't fare much better. Both women need a prince to save them in order for them to fulfill their dreams of getting married to a rich and handsome man. There weren't many expectations for women in society beyond being mothers and doing housework during these times. After World War II, some women went and got degrees, but it was more likely they were looking for an MRS degree in college, and most women didn't finish their education or enter the workforce. After Sleeping Beauty was released in 1959, we didn't see another animated film featuring a woman lead until The Little Mermaid in 1989. That's 30 years difference. There were some live-action movies with female leads, but these were definitely not as popular as Disney animated movies. This started off with the Renaissance Disney era. In this era, women get more character traits and they develop more personality, and we can see that in society, women's status has grown a lot now. Many more women are getting an education and are out in the workforce. But eventually, women in society were still expected to be mothers and stay at home once they were married. In the movies, these female leads are smart, curious, and brave, but they don't often have goals or aspirations besides what is set out for them. And while these women may defy these expectations at first, after their adventure, they return home and do what's expected of them. The first example of this is Belle from Beauty and the Beast. She is smart and curious and loves to learn, but is shunned for it in her village. At the end of the movie, she still ends up marrying the Beast, who shares her love for learning, but it's never really encouraged by anyone else, and no one's lives are impacted from the fact that she likes to read. The next example of this is Mulan. Mulan literally saves China and then goes back to her parents' house and they set her up with a man. Mulan didn't really expect to have this big, huge adventure and save China, but she didn't have any realistic goals or expectations for once she came back from the war and just defaulted to what her parents wanted her to do, which, if you remember in the very beginning of the movie, was get to the matchmaker and get married. After Mulan released in 1998, there was another gap in time where there weren't any female leads in animated movies until 2009 with The Princess and the Frog. This starts the more modern era of movies. In this era, women leads have wants, goals, and wishes that are fulfilled throughout their movie, and their lives and the lives of others are impacted by their decisions. Being a woman, though, in these movies is often thought to be a barrier to their success, but they're able to overcome it in different ways. Merida from Brave is an extremely good example of this. She hates being a princess and constantly laments about it throughout the movie. She doesn't want to be married off by her family and tries to prove her own strength in the archery competition, which she only has to do because she is a girl. If she was a man, then they wouldn't have asked her to be married off at all. At the end of the movie, though, Merida is still able to synthesize her two lives, and she's shown equally being a princess and enjoying her life outside of her royal duties. Moana is another good example of this new type of female lead. She wants to leave her tribe, leave her village, and explore the world in order to make a better life for her people, but she is banned by her father because she's a woman. And because of that, she's expected to follow in her father's footsteps instead of thinking of new ways to help her people. In the end, though, we see that her exploration and her adventure was better for the whole tribe and the whole planet, and everyone is better off for it. Women in a more modern day society are also more encouraged and expected to share their own ideas. They're able to be more independent from men, and they don't actually have to have men at all in most of their lives. These movies really show this change in society as these female lead characters are becoming more and more independent, and their decisions are really helping change their lives and the lives of others near them. Just as Disney was able to change the roles of their female leads in their movies, I suspect they could do a very similar thing with queer and trans leads in new movies. There have been some more recent instances where queer people and relationships have been included in Disney films. The most obvious example of this comes from Onward, which released in 2020. There is one scene where one female police officer mentions that she has a girlfriend. There is no other scene she's in, she has no character development, and we don't learn anything else about her. Some people were really excited about this new LGBT representation, but critics claim that it wasn't really doing a lot, especially for Pixar's first LGBTQ character. The other example of queer representation that we have in Disney movies comes from 2017's Beauty and the Beast live-action remake. The film's director, Bill Codon, said that there would be an exclusively gay moment in the movie. This ended up being a second-long shot in the closing scene where LeFou, who's Gaston's sidekick, ends up being with a man as a dance partner. There were a few other moments throughout the movie hinting at LeFou's sexuality and queer-coding him, but this was far from the exclusively gay moment people were hoping for. There aren't many Disney films where queer people are put at the forefront of the movie, but we can use queer theory to reinterpret and reimagine these movies. Jack Halberstam invites us to use queer theory to reinterpret different media in order to imagine a more diverse and inclusive world. And this idea of reinterpretation can be applied to many Disney movies to show how queer stories can be included. Halberstam is transgender himself, as well as being a trans and queer researcher, theorist, and he's the director of the Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality at Columbia University. In his book, Wild Things, The Disorder of Desire, he uses queer theory as a site for rethinking different ways of knowing, also called epistemologies, and argues that queer theory is a way for people to embrace the unknown rather than shame it or fear it. Here, Halbert Stamp specifically says that queer theory gives the freedom to engage with the canon in a dialogue in order to reinterpret, redefine, and seek out the wildness within order. Gender, culture, and social justice researcher Jason Fan has used this theory to reinterpret some of our favorite movies, The Lion King and Frozen. Fan chose to reinterpret Pumbaa and Timon from The Lion King as a gay couple. Fan wrote about how Pumbaa was ostracized when he was a child, much like how gay men are, and then both Timon and Pumbaa were pushed to the outskirts of society in order to live on their own and have a happy life. This reinterpretation subverts many people's expectations of gay couples, since Simba turns into a practically well-functioning and presumably straight adult after he is adopted by this queer couple. Fan also chooses to reinterpret Elsa's struggle with containing, maintaining, and controlling her power over ice and snow to containing, maintaining, and controlling homosexual urges or lesbianism. Elsa was told by her parents to lock and seal away her power, and she was shunned, which is often how many queer people feel when they are in the closet. Frozen as a whole already subverts people's expectations and assumptions that romantic heterosexual love is the only true love, so adding this as another layer in the movie is not far off. I wanted to add my own reinterpretation of a Disney movie into this mix, and one of the most obvious examples I could think of was how Luisa and Isabella Madrigal from Encanto both embody the two typical stereotypes of lesbian women. Luisa is most obviously seen as a butch lesbian. She is extremely strong and powerful and very masculine presenting, and she does a lot of the hard work around the family. Luisa's song Surface Pressure can be reinterpreted to see how Luisa feels about having to conform to everyone's expectations of her sexuality and how she feels worthless if she's not satisfying everyone. Seeing how she runs off crying at the end of the song, we can see that Luisa still hasn't confronted her sexuality and instead chooses to remain conforming. On the other hand, we can see Isabella reinterpreted as a femme lesbian. She is the perfect golden child of the Madrigal family, and she's very typically beautiful and feminine presenting. Isabella first hints at her sexuality when she talks about not wanting to marry a man from the village that her abuela is setting her up with, but there are different parts of her sexuality that are hinted at throughout the movie. Isabella's song can be powerfully reinterpreted as a woman coming to terms with her sexuality and coming out to others. What Else Can I Do shows Isabella celebrating creating something imperfect and unexpected, which is in direct contrast to how Luisa reacted when she felt the need to defy her family's expectations. Along with that, Isabella is shunned when she starts creating new and unexpected things, which is how many queer people feel when they first come out of the closet. Shunned and disregarded. In the last section of this podcast, I want to give suggestions for how Disney and really any media production company could include LGBTQ stories in their media, whether that be movies, TV shows, books, etc. Specifically for Disney, seeing how their female leads have changed over time and how there is already some queer representation and reinterpretation able to be made with their movies, there are a few different paths that I would suggest Disney could take in order to tell meaningful queer stories. For these ideas, I want to emphasize that queerness doesn't exist in a vacuum. Much like how female leads in Disney movies change because of people's views of women, I hope that Disney and all media production companies will work towards representing queer characters as they interact with others and their environment. When I'm making these suggestions, I'm thinking a lot about the points made by Angela Davis in Difficult Dialogues. Davis is a Black, lesbian, social, and political activist who focuses on the complexity of addressing interconnecting identities while also being a feminist activist. In her book, The Meaning of Freedom and Other Difficult Dialogues, Chapter 12, Difficult Dialogues, she emphasizes how feminist critique must be responsive to societal change. In my research, I'm working with the knowledge that I currently have living in the U.S. society in 2022. There may be more research that needs to be done in the future or more suggestions that would be needed in order to better encompass the issue. There could also be more to be done to encompass the issue in the future, so some of these suggestions could become irrelevant. My first suggestion for this is to start small. If a company or media production isn't entirely sure how to go about telling queer stories, then maybe it's better to tell another story with a queer character as an element of it. Have a supporting character be queer as part of their backstory, or have a character who is on screen for multiple scenes in the movie be queer. I think The Cop and Onward was a great start for this, and it could just be really expanded on. For her, having a girlfriend was just part of her life and not something that she needed to explain to everyone or defend. And I think that's a really good starting example to expand upon. The easiest way to incorporate this kind of stuff would be having the main character's best friend or neighbor or teacher be queer. And even then, the easiest way to show that would be through a gay or a lesbian couple. The second way to incorporate different queer stories would be through the coming out trope. Coming out is something that many queer and trans people in Western society go through during their life. Sydney Dye was a student at Elon University in communication design. She published an article titled Representing Sexuality, an analysis of coming out in contemporary film, where she analyzed how coming out, other characters' reactions, and the circumstances of coming out were portrayed in popular film. Overall, Dye found that most of the movies she analyzed, out characters were mostly white men, and many times they had to defend their sexuality to others. While this is not ideal, and there are many queer stories and coming out stories that don't revolve around cisgendered white men, it does show that there is a space, a want, and a need for these types of movies. While coming out doesn't have to be the entire plot for a movie, and it would probably be a pretty boring movie if that's what it was about, it's something relatable for many queer and trans people and could really help the LGBTQ community feel seen if it was done well. This could be integrated kind of similar to how Brave was shown. Merida had to prove to everyone that she was still worthy even if she didn't have anyone to marry. The main character in a queer film could go on a journey to try and prove to others that they are still worthy of love and society, even though they don't fit those societal norms. Finally, for something I think would be pretty ambitious right off the bat, but could do really well in the time that we're in, is a movie about questioning, self-discovery, and exploration. Many queer people often go through the process of questioning their gender or sexuality, thinking about what identity they are and what makes them them. This type of plot would do the best to integrate other aspects of society and the characters' lives into one story, kind of that intersectional viewpoint that we were talking about with Davis. The main character would go on some sort of journey that would require them to face their own biases, doubts, and fears in order to become a better person and a better part of their community. This type of story could work really well, especially if it's told from the POV of a person of color in a dominantly white society. So they have to interact with both the dominant white cultural influences and also their own cultural influences. There are many stories where characters have to discover themselves, but I think Encanto is an excellent example where a queer aspect could have been included. Mirabel had to face her true feelings about her family and their relationships in order to work to save the people she loved. Something similar could be used in order to tell a queer tale of self-discovery, self-love, and self-reflection. As societal viewpoints on queer people changes and slowly starts to become more accepting, it's important that our media shows that as well. In the future, I hope that Disney will start to live up to their own claims of being inclusive and telling diverse stories. And while this podcast was focused on queer stories and trans stories, there are many other minorities and other diversities that need stories as well. Disney is touching on some racial diversities in their movies, but there are a lot of other critiques about what is happening there. Another area where I haven't seen a lot of representation is through ability and disability, both physically and mentally, which I think could be another really interesting thing to research. Along with that, we don't see a lot of religion in many Disney movies, but we also don't see a lot of religious diversity in the movies where religion is present. So maybe it would be interesting to touch on stories about different religions as well. Thank you so much for listening to this special one-off podcast episode. Once again, I am Catherine Schofield, and as of recording this podcast, I am supposed to be graduating in less than a week. You can support me further by following me on Instagram and Twitter. I'm at cooking_catfish. I do post a lot of journalism content on there, as that is what I'm hoping to be doing in the future. But I am also hoping to incorporate more women's studies aspects and feminist research into my career in the future. Once again, thank you so much for listening, and I hope that you have a great rest of your day.